Acadêmico. Eu começo essa mesa, que está em formato híbrido, com as minhas boas-vindas aos novos e os antigos alunos e alunas do nosso programa. Acho que, para mim, vocês tornam essa atividade bem mais construtiva e significativa. Eu propus 2 momentos para essa mesa de hoje, que vai até o meio-dia. Um debate em inglês com esses convidados tão ilustres, que está aberto no YouTube, sobre questões contemporâneas que movem a nossa agenda de reflexão e pesquisa aqui no Núcleo, e uma discussão depois mais intimista com vocês sobre os projetos que estão em andamento no Núcleo de Direito Global em Desenvolvimento e dentro da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, em parceria com a Vera, inclusive, e com o professor Fabio Morosini, parceiro de tantos anos. Eu vou dar início a essa sessão em inglês. No final, caso vocês tenham perguntas, elas podem ser feitas em inglês ou português. E provavelmente a gente tem um tempo mais extra, eu, Fábio e Vera com vocês, dado que o Vitor e o Nicolas têm uma limitação. So good morning and welcome to all. It is an immense pleasure to open this session in the company of my invited colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us in this welcome week of the Master and PhD program on Law and Development, and to this panel about international economic law by other means, ? This is a question that has moved our research agenda at FGV in the last few years. We invite you all to explore modes of regulating the economics of the future in this session with us. Professor Vera, our chair today, and professor at Getúlio Vargas School of Economics, and longtime partner at the Center on Global Trade and Investment. And our commentators who follow us virtually from Canada, Europe, and Porto Alegre in Brazil. Professor Nicholas Lamp, who co-authors with Antia Roberts the inspiring book, 6 Faces of Globalization, that will be part of our discussion here. He's a professor at Queen's University in Canada and has experience as a practitioner of international trade law. Mr. Vitor do Prado, a former Brazilian diplomat and servant at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Today, I would say he's one of the great experts on international economic law with a Brazilian soul. And Professor Fabio Morosini, with whom I have worked for the last 10 years in looking for alternative modes of regulating the international economic law system. With this introduction, I open our first session, and Vera, now you are our boss.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I'm an economist, and I work with a lot of lawyers, so it's funny to work with you. And use the word economics in such a friendly way. Come on, economics is also a very complicated issue. But to put the 2 things together is really interesting. Now, I am the guardian of the clock. So, Nicholas, the first question is for you. What are the dynamics of globalization that have recently changed the regulatory reference for global economic transaction? Come on, this is a question of a lawyer, Michelle. The question is, globalization is here, and what is changing? We have a new word, right? And we have to change everything, and to think economics is changing, and everything will be changing. Nicholas, for you, give us the answer. What we're going to do?
Well, I don't have many answers. I have some questions myself, or some ways of maybe thinking about the issue. So if you look at the news, you'll see a talk everywhere about the fact that globalization is in crisis. You even hear some people say that there's the end of globalization is coming. And I think much of this is probably exaggerated, because if we look at the actual numbers, you see that trade is still very strong. We just hit a record between in goods trade between the US and China, for example. So we don't yet see in the numbers a lot of decoupling, for example. But one thing that has definitely changed is the way we talk about this globalization, the discourse about globalization. It used to be the case that this what Anthony and I in our book call the establishment narrative was really dominant. The idea that trade would create a bigger pie, so we can all get a bigger piece, right? And so that was the job of trade policy, was to make sure that we are all going to be more prosperous by having a more efficient international division of labor. And then it was the job of domestic policy to then make sure that this bigger pie is divided fairly. an important concept for this establishment narrative was the idea of adjustment. The establishment narrative did not deny that there were some people who would lose their jobs as a result of increased international competition, but the idea was that these people would have to adjust, and once they adjusted, they would ultimately also be better off. So this was the dominant narrative, and when I was in university in the early 2000s, the only real challenge to this narrative actually came from the global south and from countries like Brazil, but also India, who were saying that this system was really serving to entrench a division of labor which was disadvantageous for developing countries, right? Where developing countries were mostly exporting primary products, and by having free trade and not allowing these countries to grow their infant industries, the system was entrenching this old division of labor, which was disadvantageous. What's really striking about the last 7 years, so since 2015, 2016, is that this critique from the global south, which we in the book call the neo-colonial narrative, has been joined by other critiques, other narratives that are critical of the establishment narrative in the West. And you probably all know Donald Trump. His critique, which is best described as a protectionist critique, essentially says that the trade-offs that this establishment narrative is willing to accept, like where some people lose their jobs, but then everybody gets access to cheaper products, is simply not worth it. He was essentially saying that the jobs that were being lost were so important to the fabric of American life that when they were gone, it would lead to the disintegration of communities. It would lead to deaths of despair of the workers. That just because we Americans were able to get access to cheaper products from Amazon wasn't really worth paying this price. So that was this new, powerful right-wing critique, which has now actually been adopted by the Democratic Party. So you hear very similar ideas from the Biden administration. And so you can say that the Trump administration has permanently changed the trajectory of US trade policy. But we also have critiques from the left, which are focusing on aspects of international economic agreements, such as protection for investments or intellectual property rights, which essentially distribute income from the bottom up, right? They make medicines more expensive. They force governments to make huge payouts to investors, and thereby benefit the richest, who are the shareholders of these corporations, at the expense of the general public and governments as well. And I'm sorry, these are just two narratives, but we argue in the book that there are at least three more. One is, which has really come to the fore since 2018, is a security-focused narrative. So the establishment narrative always had this view, and it's very strongly embedded in the DNA of the World Trade Organization, that trade will lead to peace, right? If countries are trading with each other, it becomes more expensive to engage in war, and therefore, the more we trade, the better it is for world peace. This new geoeconomic narrative, which has been emerging, and particularly in the United States, says that actually it's irresponsible to engage in trade and to become economically interdependent with a country that you do not trust, where you don't trust the government. Because what you are essentially doing is you are creating vulnerabilities, which this other country they can then exploit. And it was primarily, the focus of this narrative was primarily the China-US relationship. But since Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Europe has also fully embraced this narrative, because of course that's exactly what Europe experienced after Russia invaded Ukraine, that it was heavily dependent on Russian gas, and Russia was weaponizing these interdependencies. Of course, the West is also doing the same through the sanctions. It's also weaponizing interdependencies. And so this is a shift towards seeing interdependency as something that can be quite dangerous if you're not, if you're interdependent with someone who's a strategic competitor who you do not trust. And then two final narratives. One focuses on sustainability, and it essentially sees globalization as an engine for the global diffusion of Western patterns of production and consumption, which drive us into the climate abyss. Right? They just sustain it. I mean, we just know as a fact that if everybody lived like the West lived, we would be in climate hell, and we're going there very fast. On the other hand, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and the idea that pandemic drove home was that actually having efficient, far-flung supply chains is not always a good thing, because these supply chains can be fragile. And if you're faced with a demand shock such as at the beginning of the pandemic, when suddenly everybody was scrambling for protective equipment, for ventilators, or later on when everybody was trying to get vaccines, not having control of manufacturing outputs because you don't have any manufacturing, any production at home, can actually mean that you're not resilient and you're dependent on others for the production. And just, for example, to give one example of Canada, Canada was dependent on imports from Europe for vaccines because there was no manufacturing production facility here in Canada that was able to produce the mRNA vaccines. So we have the predominant value of the establishment narrative, which was efficiency and the prosperity that it can create, has been challenged by these other values, the importance of having good jobs, the dangers of inequality, the importance of security, of resilience, and sustainability. So what is that doing to the way we regulate globalization, which is what the question is getting at? So in the West, we're seeing an approach which I call multi-purpose trade policy. So you see, especially the US government and the European Union, essentially taking these critiques on board and saying, okay, we'll make sure that trade policy from now on is not just pursuing trade liberalization, but it's also trying to promote these other values. So you see it, for example, in the European Union adopting a carbon border adjustment mechanism. We've talked about carbon border adjustment mechanisms for 20 years, but they have never been implemented simply because there was inevitably going to be a lot of trade friction. There's simply no way to do this in a very clean manner, which does not in some way discriminate and is unfair to some. But the European Union at this point has said, okay, climate is in this context more important than the trade conflicts, and therefore is prioritizing this project. In the United States, you've primarily seen a shift towards prioritizing national security over economic benefits. But you also see other objectives entering the conversation. So, for example, the promotion of labor rights, the promotion of environmental objectives in trade agreements. So, for example, the United States has these agreements with Peru, which has an annex on forest sector governance, which is really trying to force Peru to get its house in order when it comes to managing the Amazon. And so we see all these new objectives coming into trade policy, not as kind of side issues that you have to deal with in order to have fair competition, but rather as objectives that sit alongside trade liberalization, and in some cases take precedence over trade liberalization as the main objectives that trade policy is trying to pursue.
Okay, Nicholas.
Final word on,
yeah.
Yes.
Final
okay.
word.
Final word on what does this look like from the perspective of developing countries? Can't speak really to that, but what I've observed is two reactions. One is many developing countries are very skeptical of this move. They see it as a pretext for protectionism. They don't think that, for example, trade policy should be concerned with labor rights primarily. But there's also another way in which developing countries could respond, because developing countries have always argued that development should be the main objective of trade policy rather than liberalization as such. And so, in a way, developed countries are now coming around to the view that trade policy has other objectives to pursue than just efficiency.
Good, very well. Now, Victor do Prado, please, your area, trade and investment. How are the new dynamics reshaping the legal arrangements and institution? Who is going to regulate? Where you have to look for regulation? Up to you, Victor.
Thanks, Vera, and thanks to Fundação Getúlio Vargas for the invitation. Real pleasure to be here with my good friends, both of you, Vera and Michelle, but also with Nicholas and Fabio, who I've known for many years. Always a pleasure to be with you. I guess I'd start sort of complementing a few of the very relevant remarks that Nicholas has just made by saying that if you're focusing on international economic law, you necessarily have to focus on international politics. You ignore international politics and power play in international economic law at your own risk. You cannot understand international economic law without understanding the changes in international relations and the power relations. And some people who have tried to ignore that, like the WTO appellate body members, have learned this lesson in a painful way, I would say. So lawyers and political scientists and economists have to work together to make some rationality out of what we're seeing. What we're seeing today is indeed, as Nicholas said, a combination of factors that are changing relations. The distinction between geopolitics and geoeconomics is getting blurred. There's an accumulation of dynamics affecting trade and investment. People often cite 3 C's: COVID, climate, and conflict. I would add another C, which is the competition between the US and China. China also starts with a C, so you could have 4 or 5 C's as you wish. But that means, yes, disruption in supply chains, and an understanding that the big power game is being played primarily on technology, and that technology has a link to security. So the search today is for resilience in supply, and that has led to policies like the EU strategic autonomy, trade policy, the US friendshoring, or the US worker-centric trade policy. These are all big names that have been flashing there. By the way, on friendshoring, although it's a concept that started in the US, I would really recommend that all read Canada's Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland's speech at the Brookings Institution last October. It's an amazing speech on why we should only trade with our friends, as she calls them. Quite remarkable for a Deputy Prime Minister to go at such length. But let's say, you know, as Nicholas was referring to, today you don't talk about open free trade. People are worried about climate, technology, and you have these new domestic policies which have a big influence in international trade. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the CHIPS Act, the carbon border adjustment that was just referred to, export bans on technology. Some of these policies, of course, raise questions about their consistency with WTO rules. And you are seeing the reshaping of arrangements, initiatives, institutions, less focus on multilateral, more focus on regional, domestic concerns, inward-looking policies. So in terms of, you know, big arrangements to watch, I would first cite the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. So basically North Atlantic, and references to cooperation and in technology, digital issues, supply chains, but only between the US and the EU. Another initiative to watch is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. And it's interesting, the themes, amongst the themes of IPEF, you would see first and foremost, fair and resilient trade. So again, no reference to open trade or to free trade. The talk is fair and resilient trade, supply chain resilience, and etc. Last but not least, in the WTO, the areas where you're seeing some traction today are not multilateral, but rather plurilateral initiatives like the e-commerce joint statement, investment services, and the discussions on trade and environment sustainability. That's where you see things happening today. So in short, we're living a moment of change, less willingness for multilateral cooperation in trade. And as a side comment, the presence of Russian delegates in international fora has become a big issue for the functioning of these fora. The focus today is in new forms and limited international cooperation in other issues. Thanks, Vera.
Wow, it's fantastic. Just to tell you that I heard a lot about what's going on, the discussion on plastic in the WTO. It's amazing. They are really trying to make an arrangement to deal with the pollution of plastic and microplastics and all of this. Michel, Fabio, let's move to geopolitics, geoeconomics shifts. Which new types of regulation are you envisaged for this new world?
Okay, so as you see, we are going like closer to the hardcore of law. And I wanted to start with the recent announcements by the Scholarship on International Economic Law, mainly the robust production from the Northern Academy in Europe and the US, that we are living a transformation in the international economic law paradigms, as we've heard previously. And as provoked by Gabrielle Marceau, who unfortunately could not join us today, but she will soon, or even a change in the composition of the types of regulation forming what they call a new ecology, like exotic animals and plants to the system, as invoked by Greg Schaefer and Henri Gao. These are authors that are kind of icons of the field, are referencing the change from a centralized perspective on multilateral trade rules to a more fragmented system based on new trade and investment types of regulation, as Victor just exemplified. And they go beyond the traditional interstate law, including public, private, and club format arrangements, as the Basileia one mentioned by Professor Shapiro 2 days ago. And still they recognize the importance of each day more frequent use of exceptions in the agreements due to unilateral measures in the name of national and economic security to save the economies from a non-resilient, hyper-connected economy. Scholars following this rationale have claimed that we have a new regulatory practices. And overall, based on China's strategies, they see that Victor mentioned, formal and informal law, hard and soft law frontiers are blurred in this new ecosystem. Fabio and I have a point here. China is not necessarily a game changer in the legal framework. Our previous research shows that Brazil and other developing countries have used similar arrangements to promote their economic transactions in the past. The practice of such legal structures was obscured by the previous dominant practices, as very well described by Nicholas and Anthea in their book, disseminated as models since the end of World War II. Therefore, the agenda maybe would not be to discover the new, but also to learn from the past. Fabio will comment more on our methods and finds in that sense. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Michelle and Vera. Pleasure to see you all, Victor and Nicolas. I think to pick up where Michelle left, I think we need to understand what do we mean when we talk about international economic law by other means. I think this is disputed in itself. And I think from the perspective that Michelle and I have been working on, rather than a truly novel tools to regulate international economic transactions, our framing and understanding of international economic law by other means is really the employment of less universalized or out of the mainstream radar technologies of international economic law governance. Therefore, we are in our research locating international economic law in other normative places, in addition to or in substitution to standard free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. So from this perspective, Michelle and I have analyzed, in the absence of traditional international economic law tools, which legal tools Brazil has employed in the past to regulate its trade and investment transactions. And we have analyzed Brazil interactions with Angola, with Bolivia, and most recently with China. We have learned a great deal from each of these research projects, and in terms of less universalized technologies of international economic law governance. But in light of time, I will focus on our China project for two reasons. First, because of the impact of China on the world economy and on the technologies of international economic law more broadly, but also as a response to the claim in the Western literature about China's novel approach to international economic law governance. So I think our provocation in this project is really about whether we can talk about a global South approach to international economic law, in the sense that Chinese, moves and approaches would resonate with the practices of other countries in the global South, or at least other countries defined as upper middle income economies, such as Brazil. So in the absence of free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties between Brazil and China, we argue that nonetheless, international economic law still exists in this bilateral relations, and is present in at least 3 interconnected regulatory layers. So the first one would be the government-to-government commitments, normally through MOUs, so Memorandum of Understandings, and also cooperation agreements. So, and this has been highly debated in the Western literature as maybe one of the most novel approaches of China to international economic law. But we argue that this is, MOUs specifically, they go beyond the standard diplomatic language, because these agreements, they coordinate the general framework under which trade and investment between a country like China and Brazil will take place. So we see law there. And also, secondly, they create international economic law institutional bodies, or committees to govern international economic law relations. So in the case of Brazil and China, this institution is named COSBAN, and it also admits private stakeholders. In addition to the government-to-government agreements, our international economic law by other means methodology also explore the role of domestic laws of the host country. So to what extent, we can locate international economic law at the domestic level, or to what extent existing domestic laws in the case of China can contain China's presence in the Brazilian economy, such as in the power sector, and an exercise that we have conducted. And finally, our analysis also focused on the contribution of private law arrangements, such as contracts and corporate governance structures, as also part of the international economic law vocabulary. And I'm almost done here, Vera. So this leaves open at least 2 questions that we are trying to answer with this project. First, I think that the first question is, are these new legal, or are these legal technologies that we are describing here also present in other upper middle income economies, or is it only a Brazil-China approach which limited capacity to explain the current international economic law terrain? And secondly, are these technologies up to the job of facing the challenges posed by the political economy of the future that have been quite well described by Nicholas and Victor? And then can these technologies that we have described as part of the Global South move also respond to threats on security, on reindustrialization, or objective of reindustrialization, and reshoring, as mentioned by Victor too? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabio. Now I'm put some disorder here. Victor, be ready. I'm not going to follow the instructions of Michel. Let's talk about G20, OCDE, WTO, and what else? IMF, perhaps. These are the big international institutions. They are dead, they are alive. Where the legal framework will come from? Victor first, and then I will ask more about G20. Look, Victor worked with G20 before, so what's going on the international arena? And then Nicholas can answer also. Victor.
Yeah, good question, Vera. They're not dead, but I guess the image that I would use is like the French pastry, a millefeuille. You have layers of institutions and arrangements, and Fabio was referring to some of these arrangements that are helping create international law in many layers that sometimes overlap, sometimes even contradict each other. But it's our job to try to make some rationality of all of this and try to understand how these different layers interact to create international economic law. And as time goes, in different moments in time, you see institutions with more prominence and less prominence, with more hard law, less of hard law, and other types of arrangements, even private arrangements, or even domestic arrangements that will, or legislation that will have an international effect. I was just talking to people in the United States, and what they're telling me is that the Inflation Reduction Act, which in spite of its name has a lot to do with climate change and and greening the economy, is attracting huge interest by companies from other places. So the United States all of a sudden becomes the champion of industrial policy, something that was an anathema in the past, and is attracting and is being successful, as people say. And in a way, I'm surprised. I mean, I used to be a subsidies and countervailing measures expert and subsidies paranoid, and I see nobody's complaining about the fact that some of these measures are in total violation of WTO rules. Well, other people seem to be doing the same. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. It's all fine, and here one of the layers go down, another layer comes up. And these domestic measures, these new legislation and subsidies will have an impact that goes far beyond the U.S. territory. And you're going to create a new type of international law pastry there, if you will, that is very different from what we had in the past. So I guess if I were to sum this up, as Nicholas was saying, there's less focus on efficiency and more focus on a type of legitimacy of these policies, and we have to see how international law is going to adapt. But the institutions are not going to go away. The rate of mortality of international institutions tends to 0.
Good answer. Great. Well, I think I'm thinking the other image of Victor, not your big failure, but something like the soup or crème d'asperge, boiling with things happening all together. Okay, Nicholas, G20. I was in India in last January. I was so impressed what India is proposing for the G20. That is the reform of the IMF, the Security Council, the WTO. So India is pushing hard on G20. The question is, to what extent G20 can interfere and put order in the system, or not? How can you enforce regulation through the G20? And I want to see Nicholas, and then to the same question to Victor. Do you think that G20? Do you know why? Because Brazil is going to get to the G20 next year. So, and India, Brazil, and South Africa. So it's a big opportunity to do something. India is pushing hard. So, Nicholas, your view on the G20, please.
Well, I want to answer this. I'm not an expert on the G20. I'm more a WTO expert, but I can, I think, say two things. So in terms of, I think the impact is going to be limited, and it's going to be limited by the power of, or the extent to which the big powers of the G20 people are willing to compartmentalize. Because the fundamental fact is that we're in a world in which we have an increasing emergence of these economic or geopolitical fault lines between the West on the one hand and China and Russia on the other hand. And that of course leaves out the vast majority of the world's population, which I would characterize as being a geoeconomic battleground, right? So, and that includes South America, it includes Brazil, which are not aligned clearly with one camp, but they're being fought over, right? So both you see, for example, the European Union trying to woo India, going to India, trying to kind of bring it to its side because it knows that if it doesn't, it will go into China's camp. So we have these two camps, and they're trying to bring everybody else onto their side, and that really changes the dynamics. So, for example, we see that it creates actually a new freedom for these countries that in the geoeconomic battlegrounds, because, for example, just give you one example, Indonesia banned nickel exports, right, because they want to have more processing industries in Indonesia. And the European Union brought a case in the WTO. They won the case, but as far as I can tell, they're not pushing very hard anymore because they know they need Indonesia. They can't, if they antagonize Indonesia too much, Indonesia is just going to work with China, right? So it creates a new dynamic. And I don't think that the G20 can escape this dynamic of essentially competition between these two camps and over the battlegrounds. But what is the hope? Well, the hope is that in some areas where countries have common interests, and the most important one, of course, is climate change, countries are willing to compartmentalize. And we saw that at the WTO in June. In June, we saw that the WTO was able to conclude a slimmed down agreement on fisheries subsidies. They also were able to conclude a very limited waiver of some provisions in the agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights, the TRIPS agreement, for COVID-19 vaccines. And you would never have been able to predict that given the antagonism between China and the US, right? So there was really, but in the WTO in Geneva at that time, the US and China were willing to put that to the side and cooperate on these limited issues on which they had common interests. And so I think the hope of the G20 is that countries are going to be willing to compartmentalize on some issues, work on them together, but in terms of having a broader new grand bargain or something like that, so which would involve the reform of the IMF or the Security Council, I don't see that happening at all in the current geopolitical climate.
Good. Victor, again to you on this G20 and dividing the world between US and Europe on one side and China, Russia on the other side. Can we foresee some kind of a dual system? You know, the monetary system of a hub in China, or a trade system in China and another one in the United States. Let's put security on the table also. Victor, to you.
Thanks, Vera. And let me say that on the G20, I completely agree with Nicholas's analysis that to the extent that G20 members are willing to compartmentalize and do things, in a sausage cutting salami tactics, that might help. That might be something that produces results, but otherwise it's going to be difficult. On the sort of the big decoupling between the West or the United States and Europe on one side and China on the other, I think this is a bit overblown. I do worry about a regulatory fragmentation, but not only between the US on one side and China on the other, but also with the European Union in the middle. So I guess it's more complex than simply a world split between the US and China. Things are more complex than that. And I also think that the sort of non-aligned countries such as India, South Africa, Brazil, to use a term that goes back to the Cold War terms, but should be revisited now. These countries don't want to make a choice between China and the US, and neither do other countries like the Gulf countries or the ASEAN countries. For them, this is a nightmare scenario of being forced to do to make a choice between one or the other. So my guess is that you're going to see some type of arrangement, also because, as Nicholas mentioned, globalization is not dead. It's being shifted. There's a different narrative. Trade flows are still growing, including between the US and China. So we have to be careful in checking the facts and then checking the narratives. Thanks.
Good. Thank you very much. You are so well behaved that we have time to questions from the audience. Please.
Just 10 minutes when
One-
Nicholas and Victor, so I'll ask you to have
Two questions. And okay, go make your question, and then you have two. You can, if not, I will. But let's go.
Just
Okay.
to say your name before.
Okay, so my name is Enrique. I'm a postdoc here at FGV. Thank you all for all these wonderful presentations. And this question is coming from someone who knows very little about international law and international politics, and usually studies more comparative law and comparative politics. So usually when we're studying domestic institutions, there's always this huge focus on path dependence. For those in the audience that don't know the term, it means that rules usually have this sort of self-reproducing tendency that makes them hard to change or slow to change. But when I hear all these presentations, the only word that I hear is change everywhere. It's new practices or old practices becoming more widespread. Even the rules that should create path dependency, like the WTO rules, don't seem to be doing what you'd expect them to do. So my question for everyone, because I think this is a theme in everyone's presentation, is when we're talking about is this something that is only on this episode? There's no path dependency to talk about right now in international law, or does path dependency simply look different in international law than what we're used to in domestic politics?
We are recooking the old regulations. That it. Any other questions? Eugenia, please go ahead. So 2 questions, and Victor and Nicholas can answer the 2. Okay.
My name is Maria Eugenia. I'm a PhD student here at FGV. I'd like to thank you all for your very brilliant, interventions here. And it's not a question really, it's just more of, I would like to hear more from you about investment policies that have been going up, like screening and etc. So how do they relate to trade measures and policies that we have been talking about? And can we say that they're more related than ever? Can we say that we have trade and investment policies as part of something bigger, or trying to reach a common goal more clearly than we have in the past?
Good. The subordination of investment on security. That's the point, right? Okay. Victor first. Nicholas, we have some minutes. Let's go.
I was
Victor.
going to yield to Nicholas to talk about path dependence and in international law. He's the expert. But Nicholas, why don't you try to go first?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the picture that we're seeing is path dependence plays a huge role. I think it's, and maybe I'm not using the concept entirely correctly, but look, for example, at the decoupling dynamics, right? On the one hand, you have Apple and China. And you see sometimes news about how Apple is shifting some production to Vietnam. The airports are now being produced in Vietnam or to India. But if you look at the actual numbers, it's now still way more than 90% of Apple's products are being produced in China. So you have these massive sunk costs. And it's very difficult for a company like Apple and many other US manufacturers to move away from China simply because they don't have the same manufacturing capacity doesn't exist in other countries. And so you see this is still these massive goods interdependence and massive trade flows in goods on the one hand. And so here, I think the past dependency of sunk cost, of past investments, of expertise that has been created, capacity that has been created in China, will make sure that we are very far away from anything resembling a complete decoupling in goods, right? So it's almost inconceivable that there would be a complete goods decoupling between China and the US. On the other hand, we are seeing the creation of a path that points towards decoupling in other areas. So one of the biggest decisions that was been made in regulatory terms in recent years is the decision by Western countries not to allow Huawei to build 5G communications infrastructure. And that was precisely because of worries about path dependency. Like, essentially, once you let Huawei build that infrastructure, it's impossible to get it out again, right? So you set on a path of dependency on Huawei, and that comes with vulnerability to espionage, to sabotage, and so forth. And so governments were seeing, okay, when we go to 5G, which is the next telecommunications standard, if we allow interdependency and interconnectedness, we're going to be that's a path that we can't easily get off. And so they decided to decouple when it comes to 5G infrastructure. So most Western governments are not allowing Huawei to build 5G infrastructure. And so we see it's one thing to look at current trade flows and say, okay, we don't see much evidence of decoupling, but we also have to look at the alternative. Like, what would have happened if globalization had continued on its normal path? Well, we would have allowed China and Huawei to build the 5G infrastructure because it's the cheapest option and the best option, right? But there was a decision here to go a different path. And so when it comes to interconnectedness in telecommunications, we are now seeing the West and China going in different directions, and we're seeing that there's kind of separate universes emerging of countries that are using Huawei and who will, as a result, be excluded from Western intelligence sharing and all kinds of other consequences. And on the other hand, we see the Western bloc, which is going to use Ericsson and Nokia for the 5G infrastructure, which will be part of that telecommunications bloc. So I think path dependency, on the one hand, accounts for the persistence of strong trade links between China and the US, but it also is, we see the paths now being set where we see some decoupling in telecommunications infrastructure, and it's not at all clear that that will ever be reversed.
So thank you very much. And on behalf of time and respect to Nicholas' students that are waiting for him, and I know that Victor have others waiting for him, I will close this session with them. Thank you warmly for you for being with us today and adding this global taste for this welcome week for our students. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Vera. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
all.
See you soon. Bom, muitas coisas. A gente ainda fica com o Fábio aqui conosco. Pode fechar o YouTube. Obrigada. E essa é uma segunda parte agora. Eu acho que para a gente conversar com mais liberdade em relação a algumas questões e comentários que podem aparecer do lado de vocês. Queria contextualizar também, a nossa introdução foi bastante rápida, esses convites, né, especificamente.